Welcome to you all here today. It's great to see you back again, those that were here last year, and welcome to those that are new to Eastwood Hill and the Trees for Bees conference this year. Ricki and I will give you, following on from Maureen, I'll give you a bit of an update on the status of beekeeping in New Zealand, and we're sort of really sharing that topic with John Hartnell, who will, we're not covering everything. John will pick up where we've missed out on some of the subjects. So between the three of us, we aim to give you a fairly good idea of where beekeeping is in New Zealand. When you talk about the status of beekeeping in New Zealand, you really need to look at it in the context of the value beekeeping is to the country. We are an agricultural country, and arguably the most important plant that we have in the country is the clover flower there, followed on by all of the other agricultural industries, the horticulture, the seed industry, that our bees pollinate and are responsible for. We're effectively been said to be worth $5 billion a year to the economy. That's quite a dated figure, probably at least 10 years ago that was figured out by Ministry of Agriculture then. And it could be 3 times as much worth now. These stats just haven't been done on it. So just looking at statistics, we have 4,767 registered beekeepers as at February. Those statistics have increased. We've got something like 5,000 now. We've got 500,000 hives on 30,000 sites. But interestingly, there's around about 113 beekeepers who own 60% of the hives in New Zealand. These are large commercial operations. And you could go out even further, 80% or 90% of the hives might be owned in a few hundred beekeepers. So there's a large numbers of hobby beekeepers with 1 or 2 hives in the back garden, and there's a few hundred commercial beekeepers out there. As I said, we're worth something like $5 billion annually. We really don't have a handle on it currently. We produce something like 12,000 tonnes of honey a year, with exports of around about $170 million. 145 million of that is honey. The rest with things like live bees, beeswax, propolis, and a whole lot of added value products people like Comvita do that are exported from the beehive, from products from the beehive. Yep. Whoop. Hang on. A bit too far there. So I'll just hand over to Ricki here. We're sort of sharing this role, and he'll carry on from here.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Factors affecting beekeeping in the field. I imagine a lot of you here aren't actually beekeepers, so you mightn't have given this much thought. But obviously nutrition, as Maureen has already suggested, is a huge effect. Like if you have too many hives in one spot and there's not enough tucker for them, then those beehives won't necessarily do as well as if you had fewer. And it's very hard for beekeepers to actually figure out what is the optimum amount. Trial and error normally sorts that out. It's very important for the bees also to get enough nourishment so that they're nice and healthy. So hence this Trees for Bees program. It's going to be very beneficial to beekeepers when they actually really know what the best plants are to plant. There is an increase in demand and competition for sites. There's a lot of people trying to get into the Manuka story, I suppose, and even down my way down in the north of the South Island. Even the farmers down there are starting to see how they can be part of the story as well, you know. It's quite interesting to see how much interest there is in bees now. It's really, really cool. We've also got another effect is different viruses and microbes. Often a lot of these things don't affect our bees if they're really healthy. Well-nourished hives equals good immunity for our bees. Pesticides, often the more persistent ones, the neonicotinoids, which we don't actually really, it's very hard to understand the effect that they have on our bees, because perhaps it's a sublethal dose that they're getting in the way that it doesn't directly kill our bees straight away. But because, well, perhaps neonicotinoids, perhaps I should explain that they're systemic pesticides, like they actually come up right through the plant. So if you had a plant that you were growing, you didn't want caterpillars to eat, the neonicotinoids, the caterpillar just wouldn't be interested or it would die off. With our bees, they're foraging all the pollens and the nectars from these plants, and because the bees are going to hundreds and hundreds of different flowers all the time, they're building up a lethal dose after time. And it's very hard to prove actually that those pesticides are the ones which are affecting our bees. The Environmental Protection Authority is doing a lot of work actually at the moment, and actually are proven to be very helpful to the beekeeping industry. Listening to what we're submitting with Don McLeod and John McLean and a technical group. There's also issues at pollination time which affect our bees if we're doing pollination. Again, there's pesticides, but what a lot of orchardists, I imagine they are starting to realise, but maybe they're spraying and thinking that the actual crop they're spraying isn't flowering, but then have a look at the understory. There might be clover or something down underneath, which the bees are actually being attracted to at the same time. That can have a devastating effect. There's the netting around kiwi fruit. In fact, Barry, we drove here, didn't we? And you actually pointed one out to me where the whole lot of kiwi fruit had this netting right around. And apparently that's very devastating. I'm not a pollinator myself, but I hear stories that it just decimates the bees. They're trying to get out or they can't get out. It really upsets them. It probably does work, I'm told, that if you can roll up the sides so that the bees can come and go, and when you finish your pollinating, then put your sides back down. And of course, irrigation in Canterbury with those great big splashy things. If bees get hit by that, it's just cold water, and it just, they just don't get back to their hives. So there's actually quite a lot out there which do affect the sites. Weather, of course, is another thing. And Barry, you were going to, in the next slide, you were going to show us one of your apiary sites, weren't you? Where, shelter is very important, and you find nice little microclimates and whatnot. And maybe you'd like to explain that with the next picture.
Look over there. One of the factors that affects the status of bees in the country is, of course, sites. And we can produce a manuka crop or a tarry crop or a clover crop in 4 or 5 weeks in a year, but what happens to the other 40-odd weeks of the year? And how do we feed the bees and make sure they're well nourished and their immunity is up so that they can start to withstand some of the parasites and effects out there in their environment? There's no perfect site, but this photo here is one of my sites. It's Ben and Anna Roberts' place further up this valley here, and I'll just point a couple of things out to you. Shelter is really important in a site, and this site has shelter. There's a large hill there, sheltered from the south. We're looking sort of south, so the aspect is towards north. These hives down here, they get sun for most of the day. There's reasonable air drainage down here. There's the Wharekopai River down in here. But one of the major things that attracted me to that site was not only the fact that you can get in there fairly easily, but behind and up and down that river is a great diversity of forage. You've got kowhai on that hill behind, you've got willow, you've got oak, you've got five-finger. Coming in stages throughout those 40 weeks, you've got mahoe, you've got whitey wood, all of these plants that build that immunity, that forage for bees. And indeed, it's coming out even more now in international studies, the importance of diversity and quality pollen. And that's the stuff of what Linda's research is about. So what do you do? I'll just flick to the next slide. When you don't have that. And this is where we're starting to engineer a site. And some of you will go and see Peter Hare's place this afternoon. And this is us in 2012 planting 2 sites, obviously here and up. This is the road down to Lake Repanari, and we just planted along here. Sadly, we had a very bad drought that summer and we lost many of those plants, but we're replanting. And you'll see some of the things that we've done. Paul Badger and John McLean, along with Peter here, have done a lot of work there in measuring that site and they'll explain that later. So that's some of the things you can do to improve a site. So I'll just carry on and let Ricki with the next slide.
Well, now factors affecting beekeeping, this time off the field. Beekeeping's growing, and actually there's a demand for trained beekeepers now. The agricultural industry training have got really good education programs up and running, and now you can actually immigrate to New Zealand as beekeeping is actually one of those occupations that you can apply to immigrate with. So it's actually much easier now for us beekeepers to get people in from overseas. Biosecurity is a huge thing for us. Where did the giant willow effort come from, and what's going to be next? A huge thing for us is the threat of, if ever we get honey imports, we as beekeepers identify a real risk of getting EFB, which is European foul brood. At the moment we've got American foul brood, but we've got a pest management plan to try and eradicate that, but we're very well controlling it. But if we got EFB, there'd be a huge demand for us to use antibiotics to treat that, and of course that will just wreck our standing in the overseas marketplace for our honeys. So it's a huge threat. A lack of unity, well, I'll tell you what, just as good nourishment is good for the bees, okay, so is the good nourishment of the Trees for Bees project good for the unity of all beekeepers. And there wouldn't be one beekeeper who wouldn't get the good positiveness of planting stuff for our bees. That's a big unifying thing, I reckon. And we're going to have a an apicultural industry conference in Wanganui next month, and this is going to give the whole beekeeping industry a huge opportunity to nut out some of the key issues in our industry that are just holding us back from our full potential. A more serious thing, unity in the industry. We've got the BIAC. You might ask, what's that? That's the Beekeeping Industry Advisory Council, which the Federated Farmers BRG and the National Beekeepers Association of New Zealand have created as a vehicle so we can communicate on biosecurity and bee health issues. There's a lack of funding throughout. We really need to have a look at see if we can get some sort of a commodity levy or some money into the industry. We've got Varroa is a huge problem, and there's a lot of work and research going on with that, and public perceptions, and we've got the annual Be Aware Month, we call it, and this year the focus on that, it's in August, and this year the focus on that is going to be travellers educating them about bringing honey in their baggage with them.
What's going on? It's time's coming on. Manuka has been a great success story for our industry. Go back 30 years, we were mainly exporting clover, the light coloured honeys. Manuka came along, it's a real added value. It's gone into a whole range of products and it's expanding further. I'll put a few points up there. We've just had the bell, probably $100 million plus industry. It really underpins the viability of pollination. It's lifted beekeepers' incomes. It's lifted the value of all of our honeys in New Zealand. So is the resource at its limits? That's the question. And like I've mentioned, what about the other 40 weeks in the year when you've got a build-up in hives? We're at 500,000 now, growing. This slide I had quite a bit of thought about. What about the status of beekeeping in the future? It's unequivocal we're going to be coming into a warmer climate in the decades ahead. Out to say 2100. We could be 2 degrees warmer. What does that affect on our pollination, on our bee industry? There has been some study in the University of Canterbury by Dr. Shelley Hoover back in 2012. They did a study on bumblebees in artificial conditions, elevated levels of CO2, nitrous oxide, and obviously warming. It really pointed to the need for more research. There's such a complex interlinking factors. The bumblebees didn't last as long as they should normally have done in their lifetime, but then there's other things that could come into play, like the pollen that they weren't fed. They were fed more nectar than pollen. So that is a whole new discussion point out there as we get into warmer climate. From a point of view of tree growers, maybe you need to think about, if you're in the east of the country, you're going to get dry. For the west, it's going to get wetter. What you choose for your plants. That's Tagasasti. It's a great plant, and we'll just quickly conclude.
So we face threats and challenges like any other industry. Keys for the future: collaboration and communication across agri-industries and other sectors. The rural community needs to work together and recognise each other's needs, and especially the importance of bees across the primary sector. Research and innovation, greater dialogue and advocacy with government and industry, development of skills and education, investment, and that's probably about opportunities and creating opportunities, connections, as all of us here in this room today, you know, we can make connections, and overall the industry is looking pretty darn positive actually, and it's beekeeping is actually one of the major growth industries in the primary sector. So there we have it. Okay.